Her grandfather kept that brown paper package on the basement shelf for 40 years, and no one ever thought to ask what was inside it. Her uncles laughed the day the lawyer read her name beside it in the will, a sound like breaking glass that she heard every night for weeks afterward. But when the curator at the gallery peeled back the wrapping and saw what was underneath, he sat down on the floor. The offices of Whitmore and Gauthier occupied the top 2 floors of a converted Victorian building on Spring Garden Road in Halifax, Nova Scotia, in the kind of neighborhood where the parking meters charge by the minute and the coffee shops don't have prices on the menu boards. It was a grey Wednesday in late October, the kind of morning where the harbour fog hadn't fully lifted and the bare maple trees along the sidewalk rattled like loose change. Vivian Chen, 33 years old, sat in a wingback chair that probably cost more than her entire kitchen. She wore a dark grey blazer she'd bought when she first started teaching, and black trousers she'd ironed twice that morning because she'd wanted to get something right. Around her in the room were the only 2 members of her family who'd bothered to show up, her uncles. Bruce Whitfield, 57, sat to her left with his jacket perfectly pressed and his reading glasses already perched on his nose, as if he had a dozen other appointments to get to. He did. He always did. Bruce owned a real estate development company out of Bedford, one of those operations that bought old houses and turned them into condos with names like the Meridian or Harbour Vista. He had not visited their grandfather once in the 14 months before the old man's death. He'd said when asked that he found hospitals upsetting. Across the room, leaning against the bookcase with his arms folded, was Stephen Whitfield, 49. Stephen was a corporate lawyer himself, which made it particularly ironic that he'd managed to lose every argument he'd had with their grandfather in the last decade. He'd stopped coming to Christmas 3 years ago. Something about scheduling he never fully explained. Vivian had not stopped coming. Vivian had stopped having much of anything else. Their grandfather, George Whitfield, had been a retired fisherman who'd moved from Cape Breton to Halifax in his 50s, bought a narrow house in the North End, and spent the last 4 decades of his life collecting what he called useful things. Old books, tools, fishing equipment, and, inexplicably, art, prints from garage sales. Calendars he liked the images on. A watercolor of the Cabot Trail that hung crookedly in the hallway for 30 years. He'd never called himself a collector. He just liked things that felt like they meant something. For 2.5 years, Vivian had lived in George's house with him. She'd taken a leave of absence from her teaching position at Quinpool Road Elementary. She'd been there for every physiotherapy appointment, every 3 a.m. nightmare, every afternoon when the Parkinson's made his hands so unsteady he couldn't lift a cup without spilling it. She'd learned to adjust his medication schedule, to speak quietly when he was confused and firmly when he was frightened, to sit beside him in silence during the long evenings when words weren't something either of them could quite manage. Her bank account was $900 from its limit. She had 2 credit cards, one of which she'd stopped being able to look at without her heart rate climbing. James Whitmore, the estate lawyer, a thin man with the manner of someone who'd delivered a great deal of difficult news and had reached a point of professional neutrality about it, cleared his throat and began. Bruce received the house on Morris Street, assessed at $1.3 million. He also received the investment portfolio, the vintage car George had kept under a tarp in the garage, and a 40% stake in a small commercial property in Dartmouth that generated reliable monthly income. Stephen received the Cape Breton fishing license and the associated catch quota, worth somewhere between $800,000 and $1 million depending on the season, along with access to the family's shared cottage property near Baddeck. The room was very quiet. Vivian watched dust particles move in the light from the window and kept her hands flat on her knees. "And to my granddaughter, Vivian Chen," Whitmore read, without changing his tone, "I leave the contents of the basement storage shelf in the North End house. Specifically, the large brown paper package stored at the back of the second shelf and whatever it contains. Bruce made a sound. It was brief and nasal, something between a laugh and a sniff, the kind of sound a person makes when they're trying to be polite and not quite managing it. He covered it with a cough and looked at the window. Stephen uncrossed his arms and recrossed them. "The basement shelf," he said, not quite to anyone. "Well, that's thoughtful." "At least it suits your taste," Bruce added, directing it toward Vivian with the particular warmth of someone who'd practiced the line. "You always preferred what would you call it, the authentic look. I think Grandpa knew that about you." Whitmore laid a ring of keys on the desk. "I'll need you to vacate the Morris Street property within 60 days, Miss Chen, as ownership transfers to your uncle. The package is accessible immediately." Vivian took the keys. She didn't go to the basement that day. She went home to her apartment in Dartmouth, a one-bedroom on the 5th floor of a building where the elevator worked roughly 70% of the time. And she sat on the edge of her bed in her ironed blazer and let herself feel the full weight of it for exactly as long as she could stand, and then she stopped because she had to. The next morning, she drove back across the McDonald Bridge to the North End house with 2 canvas bags, told herself she was only going to collect a few personal things from her old room, and ended up in the basement. The package was exactly where she'd always dimly noticed it, which is to say she'd barely noticed it at all. It had been there her whole life, as far as she knew. Brown paper gone soft at the edges, tied with what had once been white kitchen string, roughly the size of a large cutting board, surprisingly heavy. She loaded it into the back seat of her car. It sat there for 2 days before she brought it upstairs. When she finally unwrapped it on her kitchen table, it was a painting. A small oil on canvas, the canvas going slightly dark at the edges, the wooden frame cracked along one corner. The image showed a winter scene, birch trees, a frozen river, 2 figures in heavy wool coats pulling a sled through snow so white it seemed to generate its own light. The colors were extraordinary, even through the yellowed varnish that had built up over what must have been decades. She couldn't have said why, but looking at it made her feel the cold. The actual physical cold of a Canadian winter from a very long time ago, specific and undeniable. She turned it over. The canvas backing was fragile but intact. There was a small envelope taped to the back, the tape gone brittle and amber with age. She didn't open it. Something made her set it aside carefully, the way you set aside a letter that's addressed to you, but feels like it belongs to a moment you haven't quite reached yet. That night her phone rang. The number on the screen was Bruce's. She answered because she always answered. Old habit. Viv. His voice had the particular warmth it got when he was being generous. "How'd you make out? Get your package?" "I did." "Good, good. Listen, I hope you know there are no hard feelings. Grandpa was a complicated man. He had his favorites, and he had his ways of doing things." "Bruce," she said, "what do you know about the painting?" A pause, brief, but there. "Just that it was something from his basement. A print or something, I imagine. Old. He had stacks of things down there. You suggested it." Another pause. "Who told you that?" "Stephen forwarded me the email chain from Whitmore's office. He didn't mean to." This was a lie. The truth was she'd found the email thread on George's old laptop, which no one had thought to ask for. "You suggested to Whitmore that the basement shelf contents would be a suitable bequest. Those were your words. Suitable." The silence lasted long enough that she could hear him breathing. "I thought it would give you something," he said finally. "A keepsake." "You thought it would embarrass me." He didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. "Grandpa asked me what he should leave you," Bruce said, his voice losing the warmth it put on for occasions. "I said you were the sentimental type, that you'd prefer something personal over something financial, that you'd spent so much time in that basement, it would have meaning for you." He paused. He seemed to think it was a thoughtful idea. He even laughed. After he hung up, Vivian sat at the kitchen table for a long time looking at the painting. It was a deliberate slight. She understood that now. Her uncles had never quite forgiven her for being the one who stayed, not because it was admirable, but because it made them look like exactly what they were. And so they'd found a way to make the ending of it feel like one more proof that her years of showing up had been worth nothing. A dusty canvas in brown paper. A punchline delivered by a lawyer. She looked at the painting, the figures in the snow, the quality of the light on the birch bark. Something nagged at her. She didn't know what, but she couldn't stop looking at it. She found an old cotton cloth under the sink and a small amount of white vinegar. She'd read somewhere, vaguely, that it could be used carefully on old varnish, and she began to clean, very gently, working on the lower right corner of the canvas, the area where a painter would sign their name. The varnish came away slowly, in small cloudy patches, and underneath in fine dark paint a signature appeared, a name she didn't recognize, a date, 1862. Vivian put the cloth down. She didn't sleep much that night. The Art Gallery of Nova Scotia sat on Hollis Street in a handsome stone building that had stood through things longer than most families. Vivian arrived on a Thursday morning with the painting wrapped in a clean bedsheet tucked under her arm. Feeling the way you feel before you go into a job interview you know you're not quite qualified for. Not exactly hopeful, but not quite willing to give up either. She'd called ahead. The gallery's senior curator, Dr. Lionel Oakes, was available for walk-in consultations on Thursdays between 10 and noon. She was not a member of anything. The receptionist sent her down a side hallway to a small office that smelled of linseed oil and cold coffee. Dr. Lionel Oakes, 61, was a compact man with close-cropped silver hair and the slightly distracted air of someone always partially thinking about something else. He'd trained in London, she'd read online, and had the reputation of being extraordinarily precise and almost completely intolerant of wishful thinking. He'd published a paper on the epidemic of misattributed works in private Canadian collections. He looked up when she came in, clocked the bedsheet under her arm, and his expression arranged itself into something carefully patient. "Set it on the table," he said. She unwrapped it. Lionel looked at it the way a person looks at something they expect to dismiss. He reached for his magnifying glass without leaning forward. He was being polite. Then he leaned forward. He picked up the loupe. A proper jeweler's loupe, she noticed, not just a reading glass, and held it to his eye. He brought his face to within an inch of the lower right corner, the corner she'd cleaned. The office was very quiet. Through the wall she could hear the faint sound of someone installing something, a drill or a hammer, in one of the gallery rooms beyond. Lionel set the loupe down on the desk. He straightened up. He looked at the painting without the loupe now, just his own eyes, and he was completely still for what felt to Vivian like a very long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, quieter, stripped of the professional remove it had carried a moment before. "Where did you get this?" "My grandfather. He died last month. He left it to me in his will. He'd had it in his basement since at least the 1970s, maybe longer." "His name?" "George Whitfield. He grew up in Cape Breton. He bought things at estate sales. He didn't know art. He just bought things he liked." Lionel walked to his bookshelf and ran his finger along the spines until he found what he was looking for. A large cloth-bound reference volume with a faded red cover, and he brought it back to the table and opened it to a page near the middle. There was a photograph there, black and white, small and slightly blurred with age, of a painting, a winter scene, birch trees, a frozen river, two figures pulling a sled. "Oh my God," Vivian said. Lionel cleared his throat. When he turned to look at her, she saw that his eyes were bright in a way that didn't match his composed expression. The look of a man working very hard to maintain professional equanimity, while something inside him was doing no such thing. "The painter," he said carefully, "was Cornelius Krieghoff. He was born in Amsterdam in 1815. He came to Canada in the 1840s and spent most of the rest of his life in Quebec, painting the landscape and the people who lived in it. He is considered by most serious scholars of Canadian art history to be among the most important painters this country has ever produced. His works hang in the National Gallery in Ottawa. He paused. They sell, when they come to auction, in the range of $2 to $4 million for the smaller pieces. This is not a small piece. The room had become very still. There is a catalogue, Lionel continued, with the precise care of a man, choosing each word like a step on uncertain ground, of Krieghoff's documented works. Compositions recorded in the historical literature, but never located. Works that are known to have existed because contemporaries wrote about them, because they appear in old correspondence, because dealers referenced them in transaction records. This painting, this composition, this signature, this date, corresponds to an entry in that catalogue, a work titled in the original documentation Thor Coming. It was last recorded in a private collection in Quebec City in 1949. After that, nothing. 75 years of nothing. Vivian sat down, there was a chair behind her, and she found it without looking. Someone bought it from that collection, Lionel said, perhaps at an estate sale. Perhaps for almost nothing, because they had no idea what they were looking at. He looked at her. Your grandfather. She thought of George Whitfield at an estate sale in Quebec City, maybe 1954, young and not particularly wealthy, seeing a small painting that he liked and not being able to say exactly why, just knowing that the light on the birch bark felt real and the cold coming off the canvas felt like every winter he'd ever lived through. Buying it for whatever a person would have paid for an unknown canvas from a stranger's estate. Taking it back to Cape Breton on the ferry. Moving it to Halifax when he moved. Carrying it down to the basement and setting it on a shelf, beside the fishing gear and the old tools and the things he kept because they might be useful one day. Or because they meant something, and he was never always sure which. She pressed her hand flat against the table to stop it from shaking. I'll need to conduct a full examination, Lionel said. Contentation, provenance research, condition assessment. But I want to be honest with you, and I am not, as a rule, given to premature enthusiasm. He looked at the painting one more time, the way a person looks at something they already know the answer to. This is real. I am nearly certain this is real. The authentication took 4 weeks. Lionel worked with 2 external specialists, including a scholar from the Musée National des Beaux-Arts du Québec, who drove to Halifax and spent 2 days in the gallery's examination room. On a Thursday afternoon, a different Thursday, 6 weeks after the first, Vivian received a call. Confirmed. Cornelius Krieghoff, Thor Coming, circa 1862. Provenance traced through Quebec City estate records to a purchase in 1954. The painting was hers. Sotheby's Canada contacted her within 48 hours. The news did not stay quiet, the way these things never stay quiet in a city that is still at heart a small town. By the Friday of that week, Bruce knew. He arrived at her apartment, unannounced, on a Saturday morning. He was wearing the grey jacket she'd seen before, which meant he thought this was a casual conversation. His expression had the particular quality of a man being reasonable by a tremendous effort of will. I think we should talk, he said, about what Grandpa actually intended. She let him in because her grandmother had raised her to be polite to people she didn't particularly owe it to, and she'd never quite broken the habit. He wasn't well at the end, Bruce said. He was standing by her kitchen window, not sitting, because standing gave him a different kind of authority. His cognition was affected. There's an argument to be made that the will doesn't fully reflect his actual wishes, that the distribution was. Bruce, she said, I need to tell you something about the Morris Street house. He stopped. The foundation. There's a section in the northwest corner with a documented structural issue. The engineer's report is from 2019. Whitmore's office had it. It wasn't disclosed in the estate transfer. She set a folder on the kitchen table. She'd had a week to prepare it. The estimated remediation is between $80,000 and $120,000. And because the ownership transferred without disclosure, it's entirely your liability now. His face had changed. There's also the Cape Breton fishing license, she continued. I spoke with a lawyer in Sydney last week. The license is the subject of an Indigenous rights claim that's been working through the courts for 3 years. If the claim succeeds, and the current legal opinion is that it very likely will, the quota is effectively void. Stephen's stake becomes worth considerably less than it appears today. She'd been thorough. She'd had to be. She was a teacher. She knew how to research. Bruce sat down. He looked for a moment, genuinely surprised, which she found interesting, that a man who had spent his career evaluating property would not have done his due diligence on the property he was inheriting. I'm not going to challenge the will, Vivian said, and I'm not going to make things complicated for you with the foundation problem. But I am also not going to pretend I'm willing to walk away from something left to me by a man I spent 2.5 years of my life taking care of, because it turned out to be worth something. She stood up and opened the apartment door. I think we're done here, she said. He left without another word. She closed the door and listened to his footsteps go down the hallway, and the elevator doors open and close, and then the building was quiet. The auction was held in Toronto the following spring. Vivian flew down on a Tuesday. She wore a new blazer, navy blue, bought 2 weeks earlier from a shop on Quinpool Road, and it fit properly in both sleeves, the lining intact. Thor Cummings sold for $3.4 million to a private Canadian collector. The Musée National requested loan access for an upcoming exhibition on Krieghoff, which Vivian agreed to because it seemed like the right thing, because it seemed like what George would have wanted. The painting back where light could reach it, people standing in front of it, feeling the cold. She paid off both credit cards on a Wednesday. She paid out the remaining months on her Dartmouth lease and found a larger apartment across the street with a window that looked toward the harbour. She called her vice principal at Quinpool Road Elementary and said she was ready to come back in September. On the night before she flew back from Toronto, she reread the letter she'd found taped to the back of the canvas. She'd opened it the evening of her first meeting with Lionel, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold. The paper was from a Cape Breton notepad, with a lighthouse printed at the top. The handwriting was George's. She'd recognized it immediately, the letters bigger than they used to be, with the slight tremor of his last years. Vivian, I never knew exactly what this painting was, only that I liked it the moment I saw it, and that every time I looked at it after, I felt something I couldn't quite name. I bought it because it reminded me of home. I'm leaving it to you because you're the only one who ever asked me about the old things, the only one who sat with me when I wanted to talk about where I came from. Bruce and Stephen are good in their way, but they look at what a thing is worth. You looked at what it meant. I don't know if this painting is worth anything at all. It might not be, but it mattered to me, and you mattered to me, and those two things seemed like they belonged together. I hope the world is kind to you, Viv. I think you've earned some kindness. Love, Grandpa. She kept it in its original envelope, in a drawer beside her bed. That's where it is now. What would you have done if someone handed you a dusty brown package and a room full of people who already thought they knew what it was worth? Vivian didn't know what she had, but she carried it home, and she didn't throw it away, and she cared enough to clean one corner of it. That's all it took. One corner of one painting, and a man who had spent his life looking at things saw what was underneath. Sometimes the things that matter most don't look like anything. They just wait on a shelf for 40 years, hoping that someone will eventually take the time to look properly. If this story stayed with you, please hit the like button. It helps more people find their way to stories like this one. Share it with someone who's been carrying something heavy and quietly wondering whether it was worth it. and subscribe to claim the drama for more stories about family inheritance and the kind of justice that doesn't always make the news, but always eventually finds its way home.